Hello and welcome back to Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, get to talk to some really interesting figures in the world of publishing and writing and authorship and all of the things connected to that. And today we have a very special guest who is a friend of mine, Terrance Layhew, who wrote a really interesting book, a romance book. Very, very well packaged together for a particular audience, and you wrote it as a man. And it's we just thought it would be a really interesting discussion because we have both written romance books, but we've written them in other ways. So we were very excited to have you on board. So how are you doing this morning, Terrance?
I'm living the dream. This is like my third cup of coffee, so I am greased up and ready to keep going.
That's awesome. And of course, we wouldn't have this podcast without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems Books and an author himself. How are you doing this morning, Craig?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Terrance, for coming on. Yeah, we thought it would be cool to have somebody on who has just started in the industry and as a self-publisher. And, you know, we wanted to talk about the sort of the challenges you faced, how you decided which genre you're going to write. Like, you've picked romance, and this isn't to say anything negative about that, because both Roland and I did the same thing. But you're a man writing in romance, which is typically dominated more by female writers and mostly female readers. So it's not as easy. And not only that, you're writing under your own name, a male name, which makes it even harder.
Yeah.
You've set yourself up. I guess you like a challenge. So yeah. So other than looking better than us, for those of you on YouTube, he's all dressed in his suit, and And
what is it, 9 a.m. where you are?
Yeah, it's 9 a.m. Guys, this is how I like to dress. So I made a very conscious decision back in like 2018, 2019, that as often as I could, I was going to wear my suit and I was going to suit up.
So even when you're like just lounging around the house, that's how you look?
Hey, it depends on the day, but more often than not, yes.
All right. Well, I'm not going to ask you to stand up just in case. It's just in case. For the waist up. But yeah, so tell us how you got started. Why did you decide to write a book? Why did you decide to write romance? Why did you decide to publish it under your own name instead of a female pen name? Was that a decision? Like, what kind of thought process went into it?
So I have basically joked for years. I've always been involved in writing since I was a kid, but I've always joked because I love Jane Austen novels, and I love that kind of wry, sardonic wit that she has, and the way the characters are written. And I joked, okay, what would this book look like, though, from the man's perspective? Because obviously Pride and Prejudice has a little bit of Darcy's perspective, but the majority of the book is fueled from how do the female protagonists view everything that's happening. And we all know the perspective is relative. The story changes, depends on who's seeing it. So I'm like, okay, what would this book look like from Darcy's perspective was the joke. And I made that joke one too many times. And then I ended up writing the book.
Okay, so it's actually like a function of this specific book that sort of made it so that you needed to write it from a man's perspective. Mm-hmm. I guess. Are you talking about in terms of the point of view of the character?
The point of view of the story is primarily fueled from the male protagonist instead of the female protagonist, which isn't typically the way it's written in most romances that I read. And so I enjoyed the writing process. I always have wanted to write, and I said that I'd always use my own name. And even if this is the way I looked at it. If it's my first book, either people are going to love it or hate it. It's probably going to come out to crickets, just because that's the nature of first time doing stuff. I'm like, okay, even if I put my own name on it and it's absolute crap, the risk is fairly low. Best case scenario, everyone loves it and my name's attached to it. Even if it means the marketing's slightly lower in just general female audience going, oh, well, a guy wrote a romance, so obviously I won't read it. If that happened, then it sucks to be them.
I think I was going to say, Craig, when I first read the book and heard about it, I was kind of interested in it being driven from the male character's perspective, because you and I both write romance. And I think you and I kind of write to the regular formula of romance, which tends to have either male and female alternating, or else like largely the female protagonist as the viewpoint. And I just thought that was quite an interesting thing.
Yeah, a lot of the ones that I wrote were alternated alternating viewpoints of male, female, but it was never only the male for sure. And that is one aspect of it, but then there's also that you use your own name, and there have been, and there still are. There are successful male romance writers out there, but there's definitely fewer and farther between. So, and listen, there's more male romance writers out there than people know, because most of them, like Roland and I, write on, or when I used to write under a female pen name, and so and that was more. It wasn't really to trick anybody. It was just an easier thing to sell the book, and you don't have to worry about people thinking, well, I don't want to read it because it's written by a man. Let them decide after reading it if it's not for them, not based on who wrote it. So
and it makes perfect sense. That was just a decision very early on, because one of my favorite creators out there right now is Ryan Johnson, who he's done Knives Out is probably like right now the big thing that he's done recently. Right. But he likes playing in genre, and then he always tweaks the genre just a little bit. And that's kind of what I would like to do as an author, is kind of play with different genres and tweak them just a little bit to my own sensibilities, or turn them on their heads just a little bit. So yes, I've written romance, and I plan on writing more romance novels, but part of the idea of what I want to do as a writer with my own name is kind of follow a similar formula.
So put out books in multiple genres. Yeah.
But giving them all a twist. So it's almost like a thought experiment.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it's because I love genre and I love stories so much that if I know the elements enough and I'm comfortable enough with them, I think I can twist them just a little bit to make them a little more interesting, or at least different.
Now, the other thing I really liked about your book, which I thought was really appropriate, was the cover. And it was kind of surprising. I know when I wrote my first romance books, I got the cover wrong for like the first 4, 5, 6 of them. And Craig and I've just been talking to a lot of guests about like cover art and the importance of that. If people are listening and they won't be able to see the picture, but I'm holding up a book by Tessa Bailey, who's like a massively successful romance author, and her cover style is very much in the same cover style as your book. And it was kind of like interesting to figure out where you got all of the different elements and put them together, because I think they work really well for the subcategory that you're kind of trying to reach.
Thank you. Again, I have to put hats off to BookBaby. They're the company I work through to self-publish. And I gave them just a general idea. I said, okay, I'm really not a design person. I kind of think it should have these elements. And they're like, can you be more specific? And they're like, okay, here's the suggestion. Look at the categories of books that you want to be in, and look at the different covers, and tell us what it is about those covers that you like specifically, and upload images of them. I'm like, okay, so I can do that. I went through and I found that I really liked that really illustrated design style. And so I just picked a few of those elements, and I'm like, okay, this is what I like. They came up with a mock-up, and it was perfect. It spoke to me. I think it has the juxtaposition of reason and romance so beautifully and artfully done, with him in his thinker pose, sitting on a book, her looking kind of lovelorn on her heart, and then the books and the hearts on the other side.
And you used a publishing service. I think you were mentioning them. Could you talk a bit more about them? Because it seems like they had instinct for that.
Oh yeah, so BookBaby, they're one of those companies, kind of like Ingram Press or Ingram Spark, where you work with them, pay them the money, they will be the POD, print on demand company. And that was another decision I made very early on in the process, was I wanted to set it up and not have to think about it again. So if I could do all the things with them, get all lined out, they handled a lot of the digital optimization stuff, the formatting, et cetera, a lot of the things that I can't even begin to claim having expertise in, that I definitely want to continue to learn, but know that I don't know enough. I know enough to know that I don't know enough. So I work with these guys to help iron out a lot of the spots that I did not have competency in yet. And one of them was, I know that design isn't really my thing. And they also had that design service involved.
So that was for the print only, or was that for your ebook as well?
Print and ebook.
Yeah,
the only thing they don't offer is audiobook, which actually excites me, because I do want to do an audiobook version of my book at some point.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting decision too, right? Because that's one where, that's something we talked about as well in the past, that the idea of hiring somebody to do all this when you can do it yourself, or you can sort of like piecemeal it out. And a lot of first-time authors, and really, I mean, throughout their career, they tend to do more of it themselves to save on the money, maybe farming more of it out as they get more popular and the income comes in, right? So I guess, the question is, is it a profitable decision for you to go that way? Are you in the red or the black? Because it's the first thing, we know first time books, it's harder to sell. It's going to take time to build that up, right? And then you put out all this money up front. Do you think you're gonna be seeing it back?
Probably not, for at least a little while. I looked at this as definitely more of an investment, in that I think that my first book, my second book probably won't sell a lot, because that's the nature of it. However, I wanted them to be as professional and as fantastic as they could be. I didn't want them to be limited based on my skill set. I wanted them to be the absolute best I could make them, even if that involved spending more money and just not making as much as I'd like to on it. But at the end of the day, they will hopefully stand the test of time. One of my favorite books about writing is Perennial by Ryan Holiday. And that idea of writing a book that's not going to just sell today or tomorrow, but will sell for years and years and years. I don't know if Reason and Romance is going to be that by any stretch, but it is a book that I hope has the capacity to, as I'm writing my 10th, 12th, 13th book, is still going to be sold and enjoyed.
Yeah, and you're saving yourself some time later, because this is something we've also mentioned, where a lot of authors, they make a lot of mistakes at the beginning. There's a lot of times we look back, and I'm in that boat too, where at some of our first books, it's kind of cringeworthy, embarrassing, if not the writing itself, but like the cover and the marketing and all that stuff, right? So
I'm just thinking how true that is.
Yeah. So if you come out of the gate with a product that can stand the test of time, you don't have to later go back and change those things and improve those things when you become more popular. Because when you become more popular, people will be looking at your back catalog, right?
Exactly.
And they will be deciding if they want to buy it. And so that's why we say to fix those up. But if you've already, if you spent the time and the money to make them good out of the gate, you don't have to do that. So.
I mean, that can be the difference between a career. I was just thinking of, the first motorcycle book I ever wrote, and it was really not very good, especially compared to the stuff that I wrote later. And then when I had my first bestseller, the problem was everyone saw it as book 2 in the series, and so they went back to book 1, and book 1 had so many flaws that in the end I ended up like completely going through and practically rewriting the entire book, because I realized that it was my first book, but also it was perhaps the least strong book in my series because it was my first book.
And that's what I'm hoping doesn't happen in this case. However, even now, I'll be honest, as much as I can read through and go, wow, I really like this. Wow, I'm not that bad. I think to myself, still there are moments I'm like, ooh, I wouldn't have made that decision today. I would have changed a sentence there or two. But I think that that's an inevitable part of being a writer, is that when you look back on it, you go, okay, I'm a different person now. I would have written something slightly differently now.
Yeah, but also I just picked up one of my old books and I was reading through it and I'm like, bloody hell, this is good. It's like, who the hell wrote this? I don't remember writing this.
I have had that I have a terrible memory in general, but I've done that too, where I've read over some of my old stuff and I'm like, did I write that? I don't remember writing that. That's pretty good, actually. But then there's of course the opposite, where I'm like, ugh. I know I wrote that. Yeah.
And there's that stage, always that stage, like 2/3 of the way through the book, where you're like, why am I doing this? No one's going to read this shit.
Yes. Oh my goodness. That was really difficult with this one, because it is, I'm not someone who, I probably have a few more things in common with my main character than I'd like to admit at times. So that whole idea of it being a romance and trying to pull from my heart the least strong organ in my body was, it genuinely took effort. It genuinely took work. So by the time I get towards that 2/3 stage of this book, I was emotionally drained and empty, going, oh, this was a terrible idea. Why did I do this? But I'm so glad that I persevered.
For sure. And the other issue too, okay, so is with your strategy of like, your idea that you're going to write in all these different genres, right? So one of the things that benefits an author as they put out more books is they start building up a list of people like your fans and your readers that you can then, sell your later books to, that are going to be looking for your next book. But often those people are they're a specific type of reader. They want to read that specific type of book that they started on, right? So if you start growing that list now, there'll be romance readers. And then you go and you decide, I'm going to put out a thriller or whatever, a mystery now. Are those people going to translate into buyers of that book, right? So that's often why people will use different pen names if they're writing in different genres. So I guess I'm sure you've thought about that. And what's your plan and strategy around that?
My plan is to try to have consistent theme, if not consistent elements. As much as I'm going to change genres, there's still going to be, because I'm writing it, for lack of a better term, my personality still comes through in the book. So my hope is that that's the thing that keeps people interested. However, that said also, so like right now I've got kind of laid out in my head, these are going to be my next 4 books. And I'm actually I didn't plan on writing a series by any stretch. I actually remember I was listening to a couple of interviews that you guys had done on this podcast where someone had said, if you're not writing a series self-publishing, why are you shooting yourself in the foot? And I'm like, oh, well, I was only planning on writing standalone books. But then I had an idea for a sequel to Reason and Romance. And then the sequel immediately led to, okay, I have the seed of what a 3rd book would look like. So my plan is to write a book every year and alternate with something different and then something in romance genre following this book going forward for at least the next 4 or 5 years. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting because I think Craig and I come at it from one perspective, and you come at it from another perspective in terms of how we're going to get more readers. And I think I'd always been like, I'm going to write more books in the same genre, the same theme. And it was the genre and the theme, and like my pen name was just like the mark of approval. Whereas I think there is something, especially now with social media and stuff, to being a writer who is liked for who they are as a writer and represented, which I think has always existed. You think of like John Irving, who wrote The World According to Garp and all these other books that were very eclectic. But people read all of them and enjoy all of them because they like him as a writer. Stephen King, he started off writing schlocky horror, but then has moved into such drastically change books that drastically change in tone and experiment with different things, which I think you can do as an author if you're like selling yourself as an author rather than the series you're writing in a particular genre. And the thing about self-publishing, which makes that possible, is the profit margins are so much bigger than publishing. So you don't even need to be that popular to do that. There's this guy, Nick Stevens, says if you have 10,000 readers, then you have a career as an author for the rest of your life, a 6-figure career. So it's an interesting approach to marketing, which I think is almost opposite to what Craig and I had done.
Well, I'm fortunate because I have a full-time job that I basically only work for like 7 months out of the year. I'm able to afford to do this the way that I want to, rather than the way that would be best for making money now. I'm instead trying to plan for, okay, how can I make this into a career going over hopefully decades in the future and still being able to do what I'm doing now. So it's kind of like the barbell strategy of the 80-20 rule. I've got 80% security so I can risk 20%.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to remember and to think about, because, and this is also something that we always try to stress, is every author and their situation is different.
Exactly.
And so what works for one is not always going to work for another, right? So that's why having someone like you on is great, because it shows shows your perspective, a different perspective than some like a more traditional romance female author, so that people watching this, men watching this, say, hey, I can write romance. People that want to write something different and want to write in different genres, they're seeing that. But it is important to know, like, you have another job, and not all authors do. And so you can afford to take the chance. The success of this book isn't like whether you can pay your rent. It's
correct.
Right. Yeah.
It's for this book entirely in my head was never about actually making a return. I mean, it'd be nice. Believe me, I'd like to recoup my cost on it. But what mattered to me most was the question of whether or not I could do it, whether or not I could write something that people would enjoy, whether or not I could actually take a book from idea to writing it, because that's been the thing for me. I have written for years, and all I'd ever do was get to like that 20,000 word point, and I'd be like, I think I'm done. And then I'd go on to some other distracted project. So this book, I compare it to the Labors of Hercules. You want to have one big thing you do every year. For me, this book was that. This was my monster to defeat, my Nemean lion, my Hydra. And I did it. And that alone is enough for me this year. Next year we have to move things a little bit, but this year that was enough for the first book.
Yeah, and it's good because you're taking a chance, which is, and when you can afford to do it, that's when you do it, right? But but yeah, you're certainly not taking the path of least resistance.
No, and I'm aware of the risks I'm taking too. Is the thing. I believe me, I'm not going into this completely blind of I'm making it harder. I definitely want to learn how to make it myself easier on myself and going forward. But I am aware that I'm not taking the easy path to doing this.
Right. And you're doing what you want to do. I mean, there's two, there's sort of like two ways of looking, or, you know, when somebody asks for my advice or wants to have a call with me to talk about their career or whatever, pretty much the first question I always ask is, what are their writing goals, right? Because it's either you want to make enough money to support yourself and you want to write to market and, or, you know, that's the answer to usually to I want to make a lot of money is right to market, or you have a story to tell, you have something you want to try, like you have an experiment, you just want to see if you can do it, all that stuff. That's a different answer, right? And those two different answers determine the advice I would give, because they're both valid, they're completely fine. It's up to the author about what their goal is, but the strategy for one is not the same as the strategy for the other, and that's fine, right? So I'm glad that that we're getting this kind of perspective, because usually, you know, we'll hear the other perspective, and definitely with Roland and I mean, I'll speak for Roland, but he can correct me if I'm wrong. But you know, we did this when we started to make a living, and so that's why I wrote in romance. I was not a reader of romance in general, and so, but that was where the money was. I had a job like you, but I took a year off as you know, like I took off a leave of absence, and I said, okay, I'll give myself a year, and if I can make it and supplant my income, then I'll quit my job. I hated that job, so I wanted to get out, but I also didn't want to just completely leave it, and then because I have a family, I couldn't just do that. So I said, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to write romance, and I was fortunate enough to be successful, support myself, and then I didn't have to worry about that. But I couldn't do what you were doing. Now I could if I had the time, which is what I'd like to do, is write books that, in more of the genres that I'd want to write in, take more chances. And I do plan to one day, but like, it's a different situation, right? So as long as Hidden Gems is still going, I can do that. But, so.
And I mean, I can speak to the crushing pressure you feel when you are making a living as an author, but then you have the pressure to write the next book before the book you've just published loses its tail of sales, and you need it to hit every single time, and it kind of takes the joy out of it to a certain extent. And I think there's almost successful writers can become a victim of their own success and find out the whole thing stagnates just because so much pressure on writing the next book takes all of the joy out of it, and then you kind of get like writer's block and stuff. So it's almost like a second plateau. And what your approach, Craig said it's not the path of least resistance, but in some ways it is the path of least resistance, because you don't need to worry about paying the mortgage. You don't need to worry about your next book being a success. You can experiment. You can write the stories you want to tell. And I think every author feels that. I mean, Craig, you and I you're always telling me I shouldn't write these ridiculous long 160,000 word books with these complicated plots. I should just write what sells. And it's like, but you can't help it as a writer. If you're a writer, then you want to write what you want to write.
Yep.
Yeah. And listen, I mean, there's nothing wrong with writing what you want to write. You just have to be realistic, because if what you want to write is not what sells the most, then that's fine. Just be aware of that, and don't beat yourself up when the sales don't come. I mean, hey, you might start a new genre. You might start a new kind of book by taking those chances, and that's great, right? But be aware that you might not. You probably won't. Most people don't.
Most people don't.
Yeah, Craig can sometimes be the most pessimistic Canadian I know.
Yes.
I was going to say, maybe it could work. I mean, I was going to say, have you done any experimentation with marketing and advertising? For example, like if you ran a small campaign on Facebook to see whether you actually turned a profit. Because I remember when I started running my first successful Facebook campaign, I was like, holy shit, I'm making money. And it's kind of like, there's this, people don't want to take that step. And often when they take that step, it flops and is a failure. And God, I must have spent hundreds of dollars on things that didn't work. But then eventually you get it and it works. And it's kind of like, wow, this opens up even more possibilities.
So I tried one Facebook campaign so far. It did not do well. And I attribute that entirely to I don't know enough about the topic yet. I definitely sit down and do my research. What has happened is, and this is an unfortunate element of my timing, my book came out literally just before my work season begins. So right now is when I'm in the pressure cooker to get all of my work done by December. So I am putting as little extra effort into anything else that requires thought as humanly possible, so that then once I get out of that, I can actually turn my attention back to putting more energy into my books and into the marketing stuff, because I know that is a genuinely important part of the process, and I want to learn more about it. I actually signed up for the waiting list because Roland, I've heard you say such great things about Mark Dawson's Ads for Authors, and I want to take that course. It hasn't opened up yet, but I'm looking forward to taking it once it is.
I mean, I recommend that. I built one myself, so I will send you a link to that.
Thank you.
But it's kind of interesting. Craig and I have been talking to so many guests about like the importance of your cover, the importance of the blurb, all the different elements, putting them together, which is something I think you've done very well. But you haven't tried advertising with it.
I haven't tried advertising with it yet.
Whereas a lot of authors, myself included, we had books that were less than optimal and tried advertising. The advertising failed, and it could be, there's this moment, this perfect storm of where your book is actually marketable and you advertise and actually know what you're doing with advertising, and that's when you hit the sweet spot. And I think it all comes down to the elements of publishing a book that people want to actually buy.
Yeah, it requires having a good story. Again, Perennial seller by Ryan Holiday, one of my favorite books. Ironically enough, it was published on my birthday, which is the thing that I will probably always like about the book most, for whatever reason. And one of the things that he talks about in that book is, listen, you can't sell, you can write garbage and still try selling it, but at the end of the day, it's only going to get a few sales. He uses the example of Go Set a Watchman, which maybe has its fans, but again, you compare Go Set a Watchman to Kill a Mockingbird, there's a night and day difference. Go Set a Watchman will not be sold for generations as a classic, even though To Kill a Mockingbird was.
Harper Lee is like the only author I can think of who is commercially successful with one book, which is the other thing. It's like, is there any point in you like jumping into advertising right now with one book? Whereas once you write that series, that series can be sustainable.
So we'll see. I'm excited. Again, I'm looking at all this as a learning experience. I'm not claiming to be an expert by any stretch. I want to focus on getting really good at writing a good story first. Everything else I think is easier to learn afterwards. And I could be wrong on that. But I think that I know enough about marketing just in general to know it's learnable. And writing a good story is also, but without a good story, the marketing's less useful.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can sell the book if you have a great marketing, great cover, great everything, in the book itself isn't that great, but you're not going to sell the second book, right? Those people aren't going to buy it again.
Yeah.
You're not going to get the same level of success because you're not even on that book, because people won't be talking about it. They won't be recommending it, right? You can only really sell it to those people you're advertising to, which means that your cost is always going to be less. You need to really start making money. You need some organic sales. You need people to be finding it on their own, hearing about it, and doing all that stuff. And part of that comes when you have other books. They look at your back catalog or whatever, but if those books are not good, they're not looking to read another one from you. So for sure, quality of the book is definitely has to be there.
And I think though, in terms of advertising, it's so much easier when you have more books. I mean, I was showing this is the first book in my series that I had to rewrite because when I was sending people there in advertising, when it wasn't correct, I just wasn't getting the follow through, just as Craig said. Whereas when you got it really right and people liked that book, then they would read the second one and then they would read the third one. And that means the money you spend advertising to send the person to your product page, you don't have to make it back with that one book. Instead of selling one book, you're selling potentially 12 books, at which point, that cost of acquisition becomes tiny compared to the profit you make. But having that series is so important. You have to build this thing. And then I guess that would take the pressure off commercial authors to have to keep churning out books all the time, because once they've got a big enough back catalogue and advertising that actually works, that could give them a living. That's the dream, isn't it?
That's the dream. I remember as a kid, I'd go to the library and I would get the one book in a particular series because that happened to be the one on the shelf. And then I'd go, oh, this is amazing. And then I'd like place on hold the next 12 of where they were. Because of course, books in the 8 to 12 age range are published in like series of 20. And it was one of those things that as a kid, I loved so much. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to make a series that has like that dearth stretch of books, but it is one of those things that I just remember so much as a child that I would like to be able to do for someone else someday.
Yeah, I know my kids were always reading all those The Diary of a Wimpy Kid kind of books and all that stuff that just go on and on forever. And it's great for the author, because they can just pump those out and they know that the kids are going to want to buy them. And
Boxcar Children.
Yes.
They're like 135.
Goosebumps.
Yeah. Hardy Boys,
Hardy Boys.
Yeah. So yeah, for sure. And so I think when you do start writing or advertising more seriously, that's the other sort of hurdle that you'll have to face is often you're figuring out your who you're going to target the ads to based on similar books, right? And if you've taken this chance, you've written something so different, it's going to be harder to find books that are similar that you can sort of target your ads towards, right? So building up that audience to begin with might be a little tougher as well with some of those.
I am fortunate with this one, at least, that it very much hangs in that Austen genre where it's similar but different. And that is the one, again, it wasn't necessarily one of those choices for sales because that's a book series that I love. I love Pride and Prejudice, Emma. So writing a book that sits kind of in that section of the bookstore, I at least know that if someone likes Emma or Pride and Prejudice, they will probably like my book. So that is the other books. We'll see how it goes. With this one and the subsequent sequels, it's going to thankfully have that kind of not pre-built fan base, but that kind of, especially like title like Reason and Romance, it works with the idea of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, that hopefully I'm able to lean on that just a little bit.
Because I think one of the things you got right with the book is, you twist the genre a bit, but you don't twist it enough to break it. And I think when Craig and I work with authors, sometimes the thing that just makes us like internally start weeping is when they go, oh, it's a cross-genre book. It's like classic romance mixed with psychological horror, and it's kind of whereas what you've got is, I think if you're a fan of Sense and Sensibility or any of these books by like modern romance authors, you would still be satisfied reading your book because you get all of the conventions and the structure and the formula right, and you twist it and make it interesting without breaking it as a formula and without leaving it as a dissatisfying read. And that, though, if you advertise and get the fans enjoying that book, they join your mailing list or something, and the next is a murder mystery, then are they going to stick around for you, or are they not going to like that? But you said there are going to be more romance books on the way. Or
so
tell us about that. What have you got planned?
So the plan is alternating every year with something different. So like my next book, it's actually a second draft right now, is a swashbuckling adventure story. It does, of course, have romance in it, as my mom was very quick to point out. I'm like, yes, but that's not the A plot, that's the B plot. Of course, I think that'll depend on your version of reading it. But that book is the next one that comes out in 2023. Then 2024, the plan is the sequel for Reason and Romance.
Yeah.
And, Roland's saying that I'm pessimistic, which personally I think I don't know, realistic, but
Which I appreciate.
but you know, and realism sometimes is pessimistic, sometimes is optimistic. But you know, he's saying you can't do classic romance like yours and mix it with the horror genre, and then immediately springs to mind Pride and Prejudice and zombies.
Yes.
You're right.
So
that's exactly it.
That is an author that I haven't read any of his books, but just like seeing his catalog has fascinated me, because one of his first books was The Count of Monte Cristo as a Vampire. Now, The Count of Monte Cristo is my favorite book of all time.
It's a wonderful book.
It is the most underrated, underread book that everyone knows the name of, is the way I've heard it said, and I totally agree. But there's a section in that book where it says that the Count is compared to a zombie by a few of the characters. And I'm like, not a zombie, a vampire. And I'm like, perfect. That was such a great way of him just taking it and twisting it enough to make something different. It was right around that Twilight era, so he was very much in the zeitgeist, right on time. And I need to actually sit down and read a couple of his books at some point.
I didn't even know that he had written other ones other than the zombies.
That one's the one that became a movie, so everyone...
Right. And I think that's probably why everyone knows The Count of Monte Cristo, because it was a movie. I think I'm pretty sure I saw that movie a long time back and really enjoyed it, but I didn't actually read the book, and I always meant to, and then I'd forget about it.
The book's like 52 hours long on the audiobook. Like, I understand why people don't read it. It's huge, it's daunting, but it is so worthwhile.
It's 20 years of story in there. A lot of them were sat in cell for 10 years, but that's interesting. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is that was the concept that sold that. Yeah, you had... Yeah. And actually, I guess every woman I know, that would be the perfect thing. They love Sense and Sensibility, and they watch nothing but real life murder shows on Netflix. So you're kind of putting maybe they're the ideal audience. Maybe that's something we should have seen coming beforehand.
Yeah, it just shows you that you never know what's going to work, right? So on one hand, you Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. I think that did really well. I don't know, the ratings maybe not that great, but and then they'll have people that try something weird and it doesn't work, like Sharknado, or whatever.
Hey, that series has like
it did well.
18 different sequels. So
yeah. And
have you guys heard of Maya?
Maya?
The Maya rule. It's most advanced yet acceptable. The whole premise is that you can take so like Indiana Jones is actually a really great example of this. You can take things that people know and recognize, and you can push it just a few inches farther, and people will love it in general, because people like what's familiar, but they also want something just a little different. So the whole premise is pushing it just far enough to be different, but also similar enough that people recognize it and can enjoy it, because they go, oh, this tastes like what I know, but with just a dash of something different in the spice.
Zesty, that's what I call it.
And you're saying that like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is something that's just a little bit different?
Well, it's recognizable and then has just something a little different to it.
Well, except this is almost like hot sauce. It's like very
different. It was the Bomb Beyond Insanity hot sauce just dashed on top of Pride and Prejudice.
But you're right. It pushes that envelope right to the point that's going to be acceptable, and it doesn't go over. So
anything that goes beyond that acceptability level is usually a thing that we go, oh, wow, that was really an experiment there, huh? So,
exactly. So is that what you're trying to, is that sort of like what you're going after?
Maya is the principle I'm trying to work off of. This is something that people can recognize for the plot elements, but I'm going to make things just a little different if I can. I don't know. My Swashbuckler, I think, is fairly generic in terms of what it is, but I hope it's still enjoyable. I was trying to write schlock just with my own particular sensibilities.
Right.
Well, I think sometimes we need to be less self-deprecating about what we write as well. I think Craig and I used to talk about, we're writing this, but didn't even think about it. But actually, I'm quite proud of the books I've written, even though they're like just romance. I sit down with people and they say like, oh, it's just a romance book. It's like the amount of effort that goes into a romance book is at least as much as goes into other books.
Yes. Well, I would argue romance novels, having now written one, believe it or not, I thought that was going to be the easy book. When I sat down to write my books, I'm like, okay. In fact, so a correction from when I talked to you before, Roland, you'd asked me if I had thought about writing a thriller adventure story first. And I was like, oh, no. I was like, whatever. I forgot that I actually was going to write what I called an agricultural thriller. basic idea is, because I work in agriculture, I'm very familiar with it. I'm like, okay, just take a commodity like corn, and like a James Bond novel is set around a commodity, use that as like the MacGuffin of the story. And because I work in agriculture, I thought it'd be fun, something a little different. Again, Maya. But I'm like, okay, that would take work and research. My romance novel, that's going to be easy. So then I sat down to write that and realized, oh, no. This is not just churning out whatever.
Well, I think it's different kind of, and it depends on how your brain works. I think if you look at a romance novel, I don't know, people might not agree, but I think that in general, the plots aren't as in depth as they are in a thriller or a mystery. The romance, what it does differently is that it's more emphasis on the characters, on their relationships, on building up those relationships, tearing them down, and then building them back up. Whereas if you write a thriller, you've got to come up with all these twists and turns. They got to make sense and work out. And, to me, that's much harder. And this world building of a fantasy, like think of Game of Thrones, like I don't even understand. I mean, I get why he's been 10 years or whatever since he's written the last one. Like I couldn't even follow. He must have charts and, history. Oh, it's just, I can't even imagine writing something like that. I couldn't hold half of it in my head to write it. So to me, those would take more effort. But I think it's a different kind of effort, right? So for some people it's easier to do that, and some people it's easier to do the relationship part. Yeah.
And romance has to follow a formula. I mean, I said there was like long form poetry. It's like you have to have the hero and heroine meet at this point. They don't like each other. They find reasons to like each other. They have a soft breakup. They have the re-warming up. It's like if you don't have all of these elements, then readers who are used to romance are going to not feel satisfied at the end of it. And you and I both did research into that, but I did, at least I assume you did, before you wrote it. And that's something that I think was the reason we were able to publish successfully, is because we respected that and did the work.
Right. Yeah. You want to hit certain beats for sure. And you can take chances and stuff, but and different subgenres of romance might have different beats than what we were writing in. I mean, I haven't read a lot of say paranormal romance or that sort of thing. Maybe they're a little different than the traditional contemporary stuff, the bad boy stuff that we did. I mean, that stuff obviously had those ones. He's a bad boy, so they're definitely going to be breaking up at some point, because he's a jerk, but he's not supposed to be a jerk to her. So they eventually bring it back. It's a misunderstanding. It's a whatever, right? So, but yeah, for sure, you have to hit beats more than you probably do in a lot of other genres.
One of my favorite, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days is one of my favorite rom-coms of all time. And I remember, my mom, of course, loved those movies when I was growing up. So I watched them as a kid. And when you watch those films, you just see how each one of those story beats play out so beautifully and elegantly. And again, it's not trying for high art in those cases. I think that high art can be achieved with it. Again, Pride and Prejudice is considered an absolute classic, perhaps the example of these types of books, and it still matches those story beats.
I mean, you almost defined those story beats. And yeah, I've been watching all these romantic comedies with my daughter because she's got into that, and it's interesting to watch them from the framework of being a romance author, because you're like, okay, that's beat one, beat two, this is where this happens, and you can predict it. Sometimes I've said out loud lines of dialogue, and that's what the character has said, and my daughter's looked at me like I was crazy, but it's just, you get it. We are unfortunately running out of time, so we have to cut this conversation off. But Terrance, thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation, I think, because you're approaching things from a very different angle to where Craig and I came from, and maybe a lot of people who listen in. So I don't know, but I think it's interesting to have different focuses and different motivations as an author. And it seems you're smiling and you don't have as much gray in your beard as Craig might do. So maybe there's an approach that will maintain your mental health.
Oh, we hope.
Craig, do you have any questions or thoughts?
No, I agree. It's so important for authors to hear the different perspectives, to hear what can be done. So often, we have mental blocks in our heads of what we can do, holding us back because we think it's never been done, so it can't be done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we see someone else do it, not necessarily the same thing that we want to do, but just doing something different, being successful at it, or at least trying it, it can break down those blocks. Yeah, enjoying it. It can break down those mental blocks and allow us to take those chances and tell us it's okay. You can do that. You can do something different. And so it's great to hear from you.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me on the show. It's been a delightful conversation.
Awesome. Well, before you go, where can people find Reason and Romance and find out more about you and stuff like that?
Reason and Romance is available at all major online retailers, Amazon, of course. You can also go to my website, terrancelayhew.com. There you can find links to all of my different work, my podcasts, and my book.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Terrance. It's been a really, really interesting and fascinating conversation. And if you are watching this or listening to this and you feel the same, make sure to give us a comment down below. Let us know. Hit that like button. If you haven't already, subscribe or tune in, listen wherever you tune in on a regular basis to your podcasts. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. Thank you so much.